So Isabel Vaughan-Spruce, it is absolutely lovely to be able to talk to you today about this incredibly important issue that we've been facing around buffer zones and the recent case of the lovely Dr. Tasici Bolt, who apparently is she a clinician of some kind? She's a clinical doctor, and she was prosecuted for holding a sign up, a very friendly sign saying, "Talk if you want to," in a buffer zone, and she's now facing £20,000 of prosecution costs. So, Isabel, welcome from March for Life, your wonderful charity that is raising awareness of abortion and human rights issues across the nation. Do tell us a bit more about this case, because it's a very key moment in our legal history, I think.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, and it's lovely to be chatting with you today. I've got to know Livia quite well now since she started having to challenge this situation that she was faced with. Originally given a fine simply for, like you say, standing in a buffer zone, holding a sign that said, "Here to talk if you want." Now, anyone who knows Livia knows what a lovely, sweet, retired lady she is. Devout Christian Catholic lady. And in the past, she has used to run a 40 Days for Life campaign helping many pregnant women. But since the buffer zone came in, she abided by the buffer zone and just went to hold that poster within the buffer zone, merely saying if somebody wants to have a conversation, they can. And in fact, she said she did have conversations with people on that day. People were just passing by. Some students stopped to talk with her, various ages, conversations just about everyday life, work life. She wasn't sort of particularly targeting people going for an abortion. She was just happy to talk to anyone. Sort of post-COVID days, when people were out on the streets with posters that said, free hugs and that kind of atmosphere.
Yes.
And she just thought it would be a lovely thing to invite that conversation. She was aware that loneliness was a big concern for people, and often it can be a concern for those considering abortion. And she just wanted to make sure that people, whoever they were, whatever walk of life, could talk to someone if they wanted to. And yet now she is a convicted criminal because of it. And even just hearing yourself say those words, it sounds so ludicrous. That simply holding a poster saying, "I'm here to talk if you want to," is something that makes you a criminal in the UK. It's quite scandalous.
And it is surprising that it is in England rather than even in other countries, though you mentioned to me earlier that, in fact, there are other countries where these buffer zones might be coming in, that these that public space protection orders are being enforced more than in other places. Why do you think that is? That where there is no identified victim, even the judge said, there was no intimidation, abortion wasn't even mentioned, and yet, she's a criminal now. And why do you think in England rather than other places this is happening?
Well, one of the things that we are kind of leading the field in England is our abortion. We do have very extreme abortion laws in England and have had for a long time now. And as I'm sure you know, Sarah, like 250,000 children every year approximately are aborted, although we don't know the actual figures because so many of these are abortion pills, and we don't really know who takes those pills or not once they're sent out through the post. But our abortion laws are very liberal. And I think we ultimately know where this comes from. It comes from Satan, who wants to, not being able to destroy his creator. He wants to destroy the image of his creator in us, and is very keen to do that through abortion and anyone who gets in his way. And sadly, we are prime, prey here in this country because, in the past we have been lacking in faith in many ways, in Christian faith in this country. And we've seen in many areas of life sort of Christianity kicked out, whether that's out of schools or out of workplaces. And it's not really surprising that doesn't become a void. It actually becomes space for Satan to take grip. And that's why we have, in part, such terrible abortion laws here.
It's extraordinary, isn't it, that, abortion was brought in 1967, enacted in 1968, and in fact that anniversary is happens in April the 27th, and yet our situation for women is becoming more dangerous for them in a way as they take more pills at home. Explain a little bit to the listeners, how easy it is to get these pills and what kind of oversight a woman will receive medically in having an abortion at home.
Yeah, and this is another of the big scandals of the abortion industry, that it's labelled as being healthcare, it's labelled as being pro-woman, and it's so far from either of those two things. About 90% or just under 90% of our abortions are through pills now, and a lot of those pills are just sent out through the post. So since 2020, it was said to be brought in because of COVID, but we know it was something that those who support abortion were trying to get in for a long time. Pills by post came in. And now a woman, she doesn't even have to speak to a doctor, let alone see one. She can simply phone up, and she states how far advanced in her pregnancy she is, because she's not having a scan, so she's dating her own pregnancy effectively. And those pills are sent out to her in her own home, and that's where she takes them, in her own bedroom or her own bathroom. And I don't know if you've ever had the misfortune of hearing some of these horrific stories, Sarah, but I know I've spoken to quite a few women who thankfully have found some healing through Rachel's Vineyard, but have been through such horrific mental trauma and also physical as well. Yes. I mean, 1 in 17 women who take those abortion pills end up in hospital. And that's another thing that many women wouldn't know about.
1 in 17.
That's a horrifically high figure. And as I say, many women are quite informed.
I remember meeting in Parliament a pro-life campaigner who had been very pro-choice and had an abortion at home of this kind, and had the trauma, as you mentioned, of seeing her aborted child, which she'd been told would be a collection of cells, appearing in a dish which she was meant to then put down the toilet, and the trauma that followed her for the rest of her life motivated her in her future work. It is extraordinary to me also to hear what you've just said, because how does this fit in with the fact that abortion is still officially illegal except for exceptional cases or specific cases, and surely you're meant to get the consent of how many doctors? 1 or 2 doctors? Wasn't that meant to be the intention of the act originally? What's happened to all of that?
It was, and we can see it's just being watered down further and further and further. And, if you look back to the origins of when abortion was first legalised, as you were just mentioning, in 1967, before it was implemented in 68, and we know people used to talk then about it being, safe, legal and rare, and it was just for these extreme situations. Not that there's ever a situation where to intentionally take the life of a human being is ever acceptable. And once we've crossed that line, we see that there's just no stopping it, and it's just grown and grown and grown since then, and to the situation we are today. And people would used to say, well, backstreet abortions, surely we don't want to go to those situations again, which was before 1967, when people were having abortions in backstreet houses. But that's exactly where we are now, Sarah. We've got abortion pills being sent out, and it's every street abortion. Any house in the country can have an abortion in it now. And these women,
an abuser could easily be covering up their tracks by insisting on these kind of things being delivered to somebody, couldn't they?
Yes, and we already have heard in the news terrible stories of either women having their drinks spiked with abortion pills, or a woman obtaining abortion pills, a pregnant woman obtaining abortion pills to give to somebody else, for a boyfriend to then, surreptitiously give to him. All sorts of horrible situations that pro-lifers warned would happen, but nobody listened. And we also hear stories of
women. We're always told we're alarmist, aren't we?
Yes, exactly. And obviously, the other problem quite clearly is that women can have those abortion pills much later in the pregnancy than they're supposed to. So there's supposed to be a cut-off date of 10 weeks where you can be sent out pills at home. But once a woman's got those, who's to know that she doesn't keep them on the shelf for a few weeks, or that she isn't even further along than she says to start with, but just maybe doesn't realise the health implications of taking pills later in pregnancy. And once they've had that abortion at home, they have then got to dispose of that dead child, and I've heard horrific stories of women either having to kind of dig graves in their garden or keeping their child in a freezer afterwards because they simply don't know what to do with that child. And we're helping to create that, saying it's pro-woman.
There's so much confusion and emotional confusion around it, as well as deception. I work in a seminary. I was speaking to one of the seminarians who was saying, yes, I got a phone call, he's working in a hospital, from a couple who'd aborted their child and then wanted him to go and bless the child after it had died. People are very, very conflicted. And it's not surprising, really, considering how much misinformation is shared, out and out lies. I mean, I was very blessed to be trained up in my pro-life past by Phyllis Bowman, who is the founder of SPUC and Right for Life. And she made it so clear to me how things are misrepresented. So when we were talking about backstreet abortion, she said, well, who do you think the doctors are who are doing this so-called front of house abortion now? It's the same doctors, the same people. It's fascinating. And the violence that was committed against her office, and yet it was always reported as pro-life violence, which was just sheer lies. I wanted to ask now about the situation in a buffer zone when you're having conversations with people going into a facility. They're very much misrepresented on the news as harassment and so forth. But I know of a friend, and of course I've been outside abortion facilities too, chatting to people. I know a friend who got talking to a girl who was going into the facility, and she said, why are you going in? And she said, well, I think my mum would kill me if she knew I was pregnant. They got chatting, and it so turned out she didn't go into the facility. She ended up getting married, inviting my friend to the wedding and even the christening of the baby. So there are situations that are so radically different from these so-called dangerous, painful, harassing conversations. Have you got any stories of life on the pavements outside the facility?
Yes, so sadly, Sarah, a lot of these would have happened prior to the buffer zones, because now the buffer zones have been implemented.
Of course, yes.
They're really trying to censor any of those conversations. And as we can see, even just with Livia merely offering to have, well, she wasn't even offering, she was just saying, I'm here to talk if you want to initiate something. And even that's, being criminalised at present. But prior to the buffer zones, I know dozens and dozens and dozens of women who chose life, and just so many beautiful occurrences that happened. I mean, I remember one young lady that I met, and she was actually a Muslim lady in her late teens. And she said how she'd been praying the previous day. And she said, like, literally nobody else at all knew that she was pregnant, not the father of the child, not her parents, nobody. And she was praying, and she said to God, show me a sign what I should do, God. And she said she walked all around Birmingham looking for that sign. And she said, God didn't give me a sign, so I decided to come and have an abortion. And as she walked up to the abortion centre, I was praying the rosary, and she saw the crucifix hanging down from my rosary. And she said that was the sign. And I thought that was just so remarkable that a Muslim girl should feel that the crucifix was her sign from God. But that was when she decided to stop and talk, and we had a lovely conversation, and she did end up talking to her parents. And I think the reaction maybe wasn't what she thought it would be, but she ended up being able to continue that pregnancy and get some support. But so many times that something very little can be the start of a woman deciding to choose life. I mean, I remember one situation where, again, we were outside the abortion centre, and it was actually a young man who came out, and we talked to him, and he said, I've got my girlfriend in there. But he said, I agree with you. I don't want her to have an abortion. Wow. I'm pro-life, but I don't want to lose my girlfriend, so I'm going along with it. And we said, well, look, would you encourage her just to maybe, look through this leaflet and look at the help that's available? And he said, well, I'm just going to the shops, but when I come back, I'll take your leaflet and I'll go and give it to her. Well, he went off. Meanwhile, a young woman came out of the abortion centre, came up to us and said, I don't suppose you've seen my boyfriend. And I said, oh, I think it's the young man that just went down to the shops. He'll be back in a minute. Can we offer you any help? Aww. And she said, well, the thing is, she said, I agree with you. I don't really want an abortion, but I don't want to lose my boyfriend. And I know he does.
No.
It turned out they they hadn't had a conversation about what they honestly wanted to do. So when he came back, I said, look, you two need to talk to each other and tell each other what you've both told us. They kind of sheepishly began the conversation. Wow. Oh, and within a minute, they were like laughing and embracing, and, you know, that you know, sort of depressive feeling that was over them, it had just turned to sheer joy simply through getting two people to talk. That's all it took. So sometimes it's very little that it takes. And obviously sometimes it takes an awful lot as well. Sometimes, you know, like organisations like the Good Counsel Network, you know, are helping women with accommodation and, you know, maybe financially helping out with bills and all sorts of things, childcare and you know, the amazing help. So sometimes it takes an awful lot of help, but sometimes you just need to be there and just, you know, help someone have that conversation and think things through again.
How wonderful to hear that story. I mean, the truth just brings tears to one's eyes, doesn't it? How easy it can be, and also the amount of effort that also goes into it as well. I know that when I was working for Phyllis, she was always rounding up, you know, what they used to call layettes in the old days, you know, everything a baby would need, everything a mother would need. She would end up meeting pregnant women on a bench and giving them money to fly home to Poland to talk to their parents. You know, all of this is never represented in the media. You know, you hear, oh, you pro-life people, you just like babies, you don't like women. It's just all nonsense. So tell us a little bit as well, Isabel, about the March for Life, because there's all sorts of interesting pro-life things going on. There's 40 Days for Life, there's March for Life, there's a Festival of Life. Tell us a bit about all of that so that people can get involved with what they feel drawn to do.
Yeah, so as we record this, Sarah, we haven't long finished 40 Days for Life. And I know people all around the country have got involved in local campaigns. So the next campaign would be in the autumn. And if anyone wanted to get involved in that, there's an international 40 Days for Life website where they can find out how to get involved. I know in Birmingham, we had like record numbers getting involved. So despite the buffer zone,
fantastic.
You know, it's actually people have felt encouraged to get off the fence and do something. And just to make it clear,
because they're so outraged.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the actual prayers will pray outside the buffer zone. So just to kind of like reassure people that they certainly won't be getting into any trouble legally from joining 40 Days for Life campaigns. It's you know, all made sure that it's very much in accordance with the law. And we still have wonderful conversations with people who are on their way up to the abortion centre, people who are maybe hurting after an abortion and looking for healing. So it's been a really beautiful campaign. But now we're looking towards the annual March for Life, which is on the 6th of September in London. And it's always on the first Saturday of September. And our theme for this year is human rights for all humans. So we're particularly looking at the human rights aspect. And as you were just mentioning, Sarah, I know a lot of times people think, oh, pro-lifers, all you care about is the baby. And whilst that theme does speak into the very basic fundamental human right to life of the child, it also kind of broadens out into other aspects of the pro-life movement. So the rights of the woman, which are often trampled on with regards to abortion, her right to know the truth, her right to have real options presented to her, her right to know the risks associated with abortion. So, you know, we're also looking at the rights of women, the rights of men who are completely ignored with regards to the law.
Absolutely,
and
yes.
Often, you know, are silent victims in this. You know, we do rightly talk about how frequently men are apathetic towards this issue, and you know, often that can be why a woman ends up at an abortion centre, because her partner is saying, you know, I'll just go along with whatever you want, or worse still, actually saying to her, you need to have an abortion. But there are times, and I've met these men who have really wanted a pregnancy to continue, but have absolutely no rights from a legal perspective.
I think this is extremely prescient because, you know, in a society where we're speaking a lot about the problems with young men, the famous Netflix programme Adolescence, and the many interpretations of that programme that are going on, it's extremely important to know why young men and older men are feeling disempowered. I remember sitting on the back of a bus listening to a conversation on a phone with a young man talking to his social worker in tears, begging her to say to his girlfriend that he did not want their child to be aborted, and he was evidently getting nowhere in that conversation. So if you feel that disenfranchised from saving the life of your own child, is it any wonder that you're not going to feel very friendly towards society?
Yeah, and I just want to pick up on that, because actually I was talking to a priest a while ago, and he was actually sharing with me how he talks to young people, and he was giving a presentation to do with the men and women, and some of our part of the presentation talked about some of the differences, and he said it was sort of received a little bit with a bit of uncertainty about the differences between men and women, because I think people are sometimes not quite sure about that nowadays, and is that PC to talk about how we're actually different. And then he started talking about the kind of strong points of femininity and womanhood. And he said he asked the young people what are particularly good points about women, and they managed to actually think of some. He then said, what about men? And there was silence. Nobody could think of any strong points of masculinity or manhood. And if young men don't even know what it really means to be a man, what are the good aspects of man? We're always talking about toxic masculinity, but does anyone give men, good role models of what we're expecting from them as young men? Rather than just sort of almost talking about everything being toxic connected to manhood. It's not surprising that men really struggle with their own identity. And then again, when we're looking at the abortion law, the fact that they're told they don't have any say in this issue with regards to pregnancy, they feel quite disconnected, and if their wife, girlfriend, partner gets pregnant, it's almost a case of, well, that's nothing to do with me, because that's what the law is saying. They're saying it's nothing to do with you.
Earlier on, you were mentioning that when we don't act, when we don't pray, it leaves a space for Satan to act. And I think, fortunately, there are a couple of pieces of good news that I think offers some hope to mitigate this terrible situation that you very accurately described. One is that in England, Catholicism will become the largest Christian denomination in the country. 500 people coming forward for baptism, lots of young people, and men and women, young men and women, millennials, saying they're looking for clarity and conviction, a life of integrity and purpose, and they're finding it in what the church is presenting to them. And so we've got this wonderful embrace of the Lord's mercy and hope for our young people, and the growth of the church, because ultimately the growth of the church is the only thing that's going to provide the good soil for truth and goodness to flourish.
Yeah, and like you say, it is a real sign of hope, isn't it, Sarah? And I think I guess it's like just a reminder, really, that the culture as it is, the secular culture, doesn't satisfy the human heart. And sometimes, sadly, we have to kind of experience that for ourselves before we really recognize it. That obviously there's some people who will be blessed to be born into Catholic families and recognize that from the start because that's shown to them and they're able to kind of take that on. Sometimes people have to really live out the secular life before they realize, this isn't satisfying me and it's leaving me empty, like we're saying. And we're seeing that with young people actually beginning to find out the truth. I know I was just talking to a priest recently who was saying, yes, he had young people coming into his church at Easter, and he was saying one of the things that really, really pleased him was when he was talking to these young people. Actually, he said particularly the young men he was talking to, and he was encouraging them to maybe look at certain apps that were, helpful with Catholicism, and podcasts. And he said they were all on the apps already. They were already listening to the podcasts.
Fantastic.
And I think there is a sort of
wonderful,
good Catholic material out there online for people now. And
yes, I think Hallow is a great app for men. Yeah. I mean, Hallow isn't an app for men, but there's great material on there. Although it's coming from America, there's a lot relating to sport, relating to, hitting fasting goals. It appeals to, the goals that men like to meet. I think there is a change in the air, and please God, it's going to make an impact on this. What would you like to leave us with today? We have had a reflection before on the fact that international, intervention into British politics has happened because of people's outrage at our lack of free speech in this country. J.D. Vance even mentioning the case with Adam, which I'd love you to tell us about finally, at the Munich conference because of his concern about freedom of expression in Europe and in England in particular. So could you leave us with a little thought about Adam's situation and what happened with him and why we have, a VP in America having to mention it?
Yeah, Adams was a particularly shocking case because he didn't even have a sign with him. He was literally just praying for his own son who'd been aborted, actually, amongst other intentions. And I remember watching that video that was recorded at the time of it was a council officer, I think, who came up to him and actually said to him, "What is the nature of your prayer today, sir?" And just to think that someone thinks that that's an important question for a council officer to ask, and based on his answer, incredible, he was then fined. So Adam was found guilty, and he's now going to have an appeal. I think it's in July, that appeal. So it would be really interesting to see what happens there. Like you say, even J.D. Vance speaking out on it. And I think when we see things like that, with Adam's case, with Livia's case, it can be very discouraging. And when we're talking about like the abortion figures that we've just talked about, 250,000, and and sometimes we can look at that and feel so discouraged. And I think it is really important to identify that as one of the weapons that Satan will use to actually immobilize us. Sometimes it can just seem so overwhelming that we can feel too discouraged to do anything. But once you actually get stuck in whatever small area that you can help in, and a lot of us might not be able to, address thousands of people, or maybe even have that opportunity to speak to a pregnant mother, but we can do something in our own areas, whatever that might be, and it, prayer and action, hopefully, in some way together. And I think once we start doing that, we feel encouraged.
So March for Life is taking place in first Saturday of September, and the day before, is it, or in the morning before, you have a Festival of Life in the Emmanuel Centre. So if people want to apply to be part of that, what do they do? Yeah,
so if they come onto the website, marchforlife.co.uk, all the information's on there. Like you say, in the morning there's a big family festival going on with a pro-life human rights summit as part of that. Lots of different pro-life stalls,
fantastic,
things for children of all ages there. So the young adults often have their own weekend. Really encourage you maybe a little bit nearer the time to look online. That will be advertised as well. If they keep up to date with our emails, we'll make sure that they receive all the information for that. And it's just a great starting point for people who haven't ever maybe sort of really dipped their toes in this and got actively involved. I know particularly young people who've said that's been the starting point for my pro-life journey. So I really encourage people to come along to that. It's a lovely pro-life family day. And to
it
be
really
with
is, and there are so many different organisations. There's SPUC, there's Abortion Resistance, there's so many organisations that are building up a momentum, and you realise you're not alone. What you see reported in the media is not representative of the enthusiasm people feel for defending life. Isabel, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, always inspiring to meet you, whether it's outside the cathedral or Parliament, and let's keep the fight going. Thank you so much, and God bless you.
Thank you, Sarah.